I'm Julie Pace, Washington Bureau Chief for the Associated Press, and this is Ground Game. The coronavirus pandemic ranks among one of the most consequential stories ever covered by the Associated Press in its 170-year history. Here to take you inside the outbreak is AP's Ralph Russo.
From the Associated Press, this is Inside the Outbreak. I'm Ralph Russo. Today is Friday, April 8th. The 75th anniversary of the end of World War II in Europe was commemorated across the continent, but with little fanfare because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Street parties have been banned in Britain, and a Russian Victory Day parade has been canceled by President Vladimir Putin. Today on Inside the Outbreak, we'll discuss the latest crushing news on the economic front here in the U.S. A government jobs report released Friday is showing some of the worst numbers since records started being kept in 1948, about 3 years after the end of World War II. Joining us will be AP reporter Chris Rugaber, who covers the Federal Reserve. Also, economics editor Fred Monyak will join us to talk about what was in the report and where we go from here. Chris Rugaber is a reporter covering the economy for the AP. Fred Monyak is an economics editor for the Associated Press. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me today, and let's get right to it. Fred, assess the damage the U.S. government released today in the April jobs report.
Yeah, this report was somehow not surprising because it was anticipated and yet truly shocking in its depth, its breadth, and just the human toll that it exacted. We had 20.5 million jobs cut in April. That exceeds or nearly exceeds all of the job growth that the economy achieved in the 11 years of the expansion that followed the Great Recession. So we had this 11-year-long, record-long expansion after 2009. All the job growth in that period, nearly all of it, is gone now in just 1 month. The unemployment rate hit 14.7%. That's the highest since the Depression, but that probably actually understates the number of people who are essentially without work. It doesn't count people who lost jobs and haven't looked for a new one because their prospects are so dim for getting a new job. And also, the Labor Department made a point today of saying that there were a number of people who should have been classified as unemployed in April and were not. These were people whose employers shut down because of the pandemic. And these employees told the government that they still have a job because they regard their job loss as only temporary. The BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics surveyors, mistakenly counted these people as still employed when they should have counted them as temporarily unemployed. And that would have added to the unemployment rate, perhaps 5 additional percentage points. We might have had an unemployment rate more like 20%. So this is when you go across the unemployment report today, it just is incredible how vast and how suddenly all of this job loss has occurred.
Chris, Fred mentioned that in reality, the numbers might not even be what we're seeing in the report, might not be the numbers that are as high as they truly are. Is there anything else that isn't being captured in the report?
Well, yeah, Fred mentioned some of the highlights of, or lowlights, I guess, of what's not included. But there were some other things. In addition to layoffs, you saw millions, over 5 million people who basically had their hours cut. So still have a job, but are not working the hours that they have in the past. And that's now at a record number. The number of people who are basically working part-time, but usually work full or prefer full-time work. That's at over 10 million. That's a record number. And that translates into less income, obviously. So that's a key issue as well. The cutback in hours, obviously the jobs lost, the income that's been lost here is tremendous. And while there are things like the unemployment benefit payments, including extra payments from the federal government, that's not going to make up for all that lost income and will raise questions, when or as we open up the economy, what kind of ability will there be for people to spend money and get the economy going again?
So, Chris, let me stick with you. And Fred, though, feel free to chime in afterwards if you have any more to add. When you and Fred were last joined us, we asked about the possibility of a big bounce back when states begin reopening. It's very early, but that's starting to happen. Is there any data to suggest that we have hit bottom and can now start to climb back?
Yes and no. I mean, the data suggests that we're sort of maybe at a hinge point, I think, where some of the job losses have certainly seemed to be bottoming out. We see in the unemployment claims report, which comes out every week, that those numbers, while still high, the number of people seeking unemployment benefits are still breathtakingly high. They have come down steadily for the past 5 weeks. So certainly there's some suggestion that job losses may be bottoming out, but there's no sign yet that the openings are sparking much business. In some of these states, like Georgia, South Carolina, and others that have started to reopen, there is real-time data that's being monitored by some economists, including Raj Chetty at Harvard. And that shows that even in those states where there's some reopening, people are not really going out and spending much. So it's clearly an issue of people will need to feel comfortable about going out back to stores, back to movie theaters, back to restaurants, even if the laws or government orders to sort of shut down, even if those orders are lifted. What we're seeing is people are not going back to their previous spending patterns as long as they fear getting sick. And so that's going to keep the economy in rough shape until that changes.
The other thing we noticed today is, despite as bad as these numbers look, apparently there was some thought that they might look even worse. And because they didn't look even worse, the stock market seems to be reacting positively to this. So, Fred, I'll start with you. What's to make of that?
Well, it's always hard to try to divine what investors are thinking on, especially on any one day. I mean, investors look mainly at how corporations are going to be able to drive profit growth going forward. I think the market has taken some heart that the businesses in most states now are beginning gradually to reopen under certain restrictions. I mean, that has a certain psychological effect of suggesting that the economy is going to come back relatively soon, that it will be a matter of weeks and months and not years before things start to get back to normal and businesses can make money again. So I think that's what's driving a lot of the sentiment, the positive sentiment in the market is this idea that even though the economy will remain very weak, and even though unemployment will remain very high for many months to come, most likely, that as businesses come back, they're able to keep costs down. They may still be able to, drive the profit growth and drive the revenue growth that investors care most about. So I think that's what we're seeing in these past few days. Remember, the market has come down so precipitously that it doesn't take that much for Wall Street to see a reason to step back in some fashion, at least.
Right. I think that investors clearly seem to be betting on the idea that we are going to see, as Fred said, businesses reopen, and it may be a slow climb, but there seems to be an assumption that there won't be a second wave of shutdowns or a second wave of the pandemic. So that may or may not turn out to be the case. Certainly, a lot of economists I talk to seem to think the market is probably too optimistic, but there is also the element of all these terrible job losses from a cold-blooded perspective do reduce costs and do hold out the possibility as business comes back that companies can manage their labor costs and keep them down as we recover.
So obviously the stock market is a slight glimpse into the idea that investors may be thinking long term. But you mentioned economists might think that that's a little bit optimistic. So let's get into that a little bit, Chris. What are experts projecting about how long we will be in this hole and just how deep it will be?
Right. Well, it's certainly a lot of uncertainty now. So even economists are admitting that it's hard to predict, even more than normal, of course. But generally, most people think we will be in double-digit unemployment well into next year. The Congressional Budget Office, which is a nonpartisan organization, has projected we might get just below 10% at the end of 2021. So, yes, I think a lot of economists see this as a longer, slower recovery, and with unemployment taking a long time, it may not be for several years that we get back to the kind of unemployment we had before the virus hit.
And I'll throw this out to, well, I'll start with you, Fred, but again, feel free to chime in, Chris. There have already been relief packages passed by Congress to help Americans get through this. Is there more help coming? And in what form? Is there even talk about maybe some more help that maybe will be initiated, I should say, from this jobs report?
Well, there's the most urgent need appears to be coming from states and localities whose revenue has tumbled dramatically in the past few weeks. These are states that must balance their budgets. Their revenue has fallen down, and many of them are threatening or warning, I should say, that cuts to services and cuts to jobs are inevitable unless Congress comes through with significant aid to the states. Republicans in Congress are questioning whether or how much money should be going out to the states. Democrats are pushing hard for that. We don't know the timetable for any aid, but the most urgent need appears to be, from local and state governments. But I should also add that, the jobless aid that has gone out to people who have lost work, notably the additional weekly unemployment benefits from the federal government in the amount of $600 a week, that's going to run out at the end of July. And I don't think anyone expects most of the tens of millions of Americans who've lost jobs to be back at work by then. And so I think there's going to be rising pressure on Congress to extend the federal benefits for the unemployed, just to carry people through, because this period of unemployment, for at least for most people, may well last deep into the end of the year. So that's one area where I think there'll be pressure. There are other things. I mean, the Congress did provide a one-time $1,200 check to most households in America. That's just a one-time payment. There may be pressure for more of that money. People are having a lot of trouble paying rent right now. There's been all kinds of public organizations pushing for rent boycotts, because people just cannot pay rents, given the fact that they have no money coming in. And in some cases, their unemployment benefits haven't even arrived. I think the pressure will rise, and I think in an election year, it'll be hard, for policymakers to resist, that push. But we'll just have to see. It's not a given, but there certainly will be momentum for that.
So, Chris, we're not the only country being hit with this. Obviously, there's economic devastation around the world. I am wondering, are different countries, maybe European countries, handling their job losses differently than the U.S. In other words, is there anything we can learn from what they're doing or replicate? Are they handling it better or worse? Is the devastation just as bad and leading to just as bleak outcomes?
Right. Well, the economies in Europe are definitely taking a severe hit, just like ours. There are different labor market policies, though, and many, if not most of the European countries have various forms of programs where the governments there will pay companies to keep people on the payrolls. I mean, they pay not necessarily the full salary, but maybe 75%, 80% of someone's salary. And in that way, they stay on the payroll of the company that they've been with, and it keeps them connected. And that's, for example, keeping the unemployment rates in many European countries lower than would otherwise be the case. Europe's unemployment rate now is 7.4%. It's expected to certainly top 10% in the coming months. But again, in Germany, France, you've got millions of people on these programs where they're essentially paid by the government, but through their company, most of their salary. And that does hold out the possibility, clearly, that it's going to be potentially easier to recover if everyone is still connected to their workplace, as opposed to here, where more people have been, millions of people have been thrown out of work, obviously. There's been some move to try those kind of programs here in the United States. The Congress actually passed earlier this year, in one of the earlier coronavirus rescue packages, a bill that encouraged states to start programs like this, where people can get unemployment even when they're working part-time. So it's a way of topping off people's pay. We talked earlier about all the folks who sort of have been forced into part-time status. So there's a move to try to help those people, for example, top off their income by getting unemployment even when they still have a part-time job. And that would have a similar effect of, it would allow companies to hold on to the workers, cut their hours maybe a bunch and then have the government make up the difference. And that would have the same effect of keeping people connected to their workplace. So, but that's still very small. Right now, there's about 90,000 people out of the millions that have been laid off. About 90,000 people are in programs like that. So it's still early days here in this country.
Chris Rugaber is a reporter with the Associated Press. He covers the economy and the Federal Reserve. Fred Monyak is an economics editor for AP. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me today and squeezing us in on what must be a very busy day and unfortunately bringing us some rather bleak news from the U.S. economy.
Right. Thanks a bunch.
Thank you.
At apnews.com, today's One Good Thing feature is a story about those old cell phones and tablets you don't use anymore. A Rhode Island teenager inspired by his doctor parents has been collecting donations of electronic devices. He is giving them to hospitals and nursing homes for patients isolated with COVID-19 so they have a way of communicating with their loved ones. You can read that story and all of AP's coronavirus outbreak coverage at apnews.com.
That's it for this episode of Ground Game. We'll be here every step of the way during this extraordinary moment in American politics and American life, giving you all the news you need to know. Be sure to tell a friend about us, and please subscribe on Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. Some of the details of our discussion may have changed by the time you hear this. For up-to-date developments on all of your news, head over to apnews.com. From the Westwood One Podcast Network.